Imagine you're talking to someone and they say to you, I keep all of the 10 commandments. I rest on the Sabbath day. I don't take the Lord's name in vain. I don't steal. I don't covet. I've never committed adultery. Oh, wait, there is this one command that I do break, but only about once a year. Thou shalt not kill. People tick me off sometimes. But hey, 9 out of 10 isn't bad. Well, about that time, you dive for cover. This is the big one. This is the 12 on the Richter scale. Commandment 6, thou shalt not kill. It's the one commandment I imagine that everyone here in this room right now, we all agree on this one. And we don't commit this one. Remember this last Sunday, I was speaking on false witness and gossip, but I looked out and man, I could see people saying, you got my number this week, Pastor. But today it's murder, and I don't commit murder, and therefore, during the meeting, what's next on the list? I'm home free. Or are we? Well, first of all, it is murder. The King James translation is inaccurate when it says, thou shalt not kill. Because this does not deal with capital punishment. It is not dealing with war. It's not an animal rights commandment that has to do with the killing of animals for food. Those are other sermons. This commandment comes down to just 2 Hebrew words, no murder, no rasaf. And raksa means the unjust, premeditated taking of an innocent human life. And before we can say, well, that doesn't apply, let's move on to the next one. Jesus now comes along, and Jesus now makes this commandment expand. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. The words of our Lord in the Sermon on the Mount, in his commentary on the 6th commandment. It's in chapter 5 of Matthew, verses 21 and 22. And we're just going to be looking at the first paragraph there. It says, you have heard it said to the people long ago, this is Jesus speaking, you shall not murder. 6th commandment. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I say to you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the hell of fire. What Jesus is doing here is he is radicalizing the 6th commandment. The word radical comes from a word radix, which means root. Jesus takes the act of murder and he traces it back to its root in the twistedness of the human soul. In other words, just because we haven't pulled the trigger or just because you haven't slashed the knife doesn't mean you've kept the 6th commandment. If you try to kill your neighbor and you're a lousy shot and you miss, you are just as evil as somebody who succeeds. It was G.K. Chesterton who said, if you look on ham and eggs with lust, you have committed breakfast in your heart. If you have looked at your neighbor with hatred, in a sense, you have murdered your neighbor in your heart. I'll confess, sometimes I'll get up in the morning and I'll take a Post-it note and I'll sketch a heart on the Post-it note and an arrow that goes through the heart, and I'll put V and B, my wife's initial, Becky, and V, and I'll put it on the coffee pot for her to find when she wakes up in the morning, and she just melts into my palm of my hand and all that. Jesus, who was not that impressed with hearts. Listen to what he says in Mark 7. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, fornication, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, anger, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within. Jesus says, I know what's percolating down here inside of you, and it's not pretty. I mentioned a few years ago about how I got a glimpse into what's percolating down and deep inside of me in a painful insight when I was on a fishing trip with my 2 brothers one time. It was a rather primitive affair. We had some friends who just sketched a map on the back of an envelope of a little fishing village off the coast of Mexico. Our instructions, to give you an idea how primitive it was to go to the middle of the village and ask for Raul. It almost sounded like a drug pickup. We made it all the way down there. We drove over back roads, and we finally got to the village, spent the night there. The next morning, we got up to go fishing, and it turned out, along with the 3 of us, there were 3 other gringos who were obviously retired men, elderly fellas, and they were going to go out with us. And so the six of us, along with Raul, will pile into his beat-up old Boston whaler, had this sputtery outboard motor, and we went out through the waves, we went out and out and out into the wave, and we started fishing. And it was a great day of fishing. Around 4 o'clock, the waves started to get bigger and bigger, and some of the waves actually sloshed over the side of the boat. We were getting knocked back and forth and just a little bit nervous. And at one point, just to kind of break the ice a little bit, I looked at one of these elderly gentlemen, and I just sort of laughingly said, well, at least we don't need seat cushions. And he looked at me and he said, what do you mean seat cushions? This is our life preserver. You mean you don't have any? He got real quiet there in that boat about that moment. I suddenly realized here we were 10 miles from the shore, couldn't even see the shore. There was water about this much in the bottom of this beat-up old Boston whaler, and there were 7 of us with only 3 life preservers. I confess to you, my first thought was, those guys have lived a full life. I've got kids back home. And by the end, I had picked out the one I was going to go for if that thing went down. And obviously, the worst thing didn't happen there. But today, I am still haunted by the thought of what would have I done if that boat had gone down. I got a glimpse into a side of myself that Kierkegaard called a sickness unto death. And that is that hardwired selfishness that is at the core of every human heart, which is the greatest cause of evil and tragedy and injustice in the world today. G.K. Chesterton was an author who used to write detective novels. His protagonist, believe it or not, in his detective novels was a priest/detective who solved murders. His name was Father Brown. And Father Brown was this brilliant detective solving murders. And they asked him in one of the novels, Father Brown, how do you do this? And here's what he replied. He said, you see, it was I who killed all those people. Now, what he meant by that was, I study the crime scene, I get all the clues and all the circumstances and the evidence, and then I go deep into myself and I find the motive or the mentality of what would cause somebody to do such a heinous crime, and then from there he goes and tracks down the murderer. At one point, he encourages us to look for the murderer in ourselves. Listen to what he says. He says, no man's really any good till he knows how bad he is, or might be until he's realized exactly how much right he has to all this snobbery and sneering, and talking about criminals as if they were apes in a forest 10,000 miles away, till he squeezed out of his soul every last drop of the oil of the Pharisees, till his only hope is somehow or other to have captured one criminal and kept him sane and safe under his own hat. What Jesus says in this commandment is, have you discovered the criminal under your own hat? Have you found the cause of murder by tracing your own murderous instincts back to your heart? To keep this commandment 6, we have to say no to murder. We have to say no to anger. And as I was looking at that the other day, it struck me that another way we keep from murder, I believe that when you think about it, it could be that some of those other commandments are actually there primarily as a firewall to keep us from stumbling into this big commandment of murder. That sometimes breaking another commandment can be a slippery slope into murder. The great example of that, of course, is who? King David. King David standing on top of the palace roof, and he looks out and he sees this breathtakingly gorgeous woman in her bath. Instead of turning his head like a gentleman, he pulls out the royal binoculars and he watches her for his own voyeuristic thrills. And by the end, he is filled with desire. His desire becomes coveting his neighbor's wife. Well, boom, there it is. That's commandment number 10. And after coveting, that leads to what's next? Adultery, breaking commandment number 7. And then there's all this deceit and all of the conspiracies. And then there's the commandment he breaks, thou shalt not murder. He murders the husband of Bathsheba. And so one commandment breaks another commandment. It's kind of like a chain collision of cars on a foggy freeway. Think of another commandment. How many times does a murder take place in the course of a robbery? A childhood friend I grew up with, he was working the night shift at 7-Eleven. Robbers came in and Dick Gibson resisted, and the next day they found his body out in the field next door. Robbers broke commandment 8, and then in the process, they broke the big one, commandment 6. One way we break the sixth commandment today is we break the fifth commandment. If you don't honor your father and mother in their old age, it becomes very convenient to engage in things like euthanasia, things like assisted suicide, which unfortunately are becoming very, very popular in many, many places. We must always continue to uphold the commandment, thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother. Do not murder, says the commandment. Do not be angry, says Jesus. Do an oblation that zaps out the source of your anger in your heart. And then now the Apostle Paul does one more thing later in the New Testament. And what Paul does is he takes the commandment to a whole new level. Instead of saying no murder and no anger, Paul says, say yes to love. The Apostle Paul takes hold of the no, thou shalt not murder, the negative, and he turns it into a grand positive. So that by the end, he is basically saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. How do you murder-proof your life? Here's what Paul says. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Live in harmony with one another. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but be overcome with good. In other words, he takes thou shalt not murder, turns it inside out, and turns it into the great commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. When you're out there in those rough seas, don't swipe your neighbor's life preserver. Be the kind of person who makes sure that everybody has a life preserver before you leave the shore. Actively preserve and enhance the life of people around you. Be a life preserver. St. Patrick is the one who changed the culture of the Irish people from one of life destroying to one of life affirming and preserving. I want to read you an ode of praise to one of the great heroes of the Irish people before St. Patrick came along. This is what their life was like. This was a celebration, an ode to Cuchulainn. Cuchulainn slew 130 kings as well as uncountable hordes of dogs and horses and women and boys and children and rabble of all kind. And then along came St. Patrick, who introduced those Irish hearts to Jesus Christ. And he won them for Jesus and for a loving God, so that suddenly there was no more slavery in Ireland, no more human sacrifice, and there was very, very little war. See, for Christians, there's no such thing as a holy war. Why is that? It's because when you take a human life, you are destroying the single most precious and important thing on this planet. The Greeks and the Romans, they celebrated war. But then 2,000 years ago, there was this new influence on the world scene. It was the teaching of a man named Jesus. And his followers worked indefatigably down through the centuries to curb violence and to minimize the aggression between nations. And of course, today we still have aggression, we still have wars. But because of the Christian influence, there is a kind of overlay of a different value that calls the nations to peace and cooperation, to turn their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks, and to seek war as only the last resort after exhausting all the peaceful alternatives. Why is it that taking a human life is such a big deal? Because alone among the animals, we are made in the image of God. We are the ones for whom has been poured out the blood of God's own Son on a cross. We alone have been designed for fellowship with God in all eternity. And so the flip side of what appears to be a negative command is really a positive command. Did you realize in the Bible that even the life of a murderer was sacred? Do you ever wonder where we got all of our due process law that we have in the United States for the handling of someone who's accused of a crime? It was not from the ACLU. It came from a book the ACLU does not want in schools. It's called the Book of Leviticus. And in the Book of Leviticus, it is very hard to take the life of a murderer. Sometimes there are people sort of on the other side, and they say, well, just take them out and just execute them. No, here is God's way in Leviticus. You have to have a trial. You have to have rights of appeal. You have to have not just one witness, you have to have at least two witnesses before you can execute someone for murder. Hearsay is just thrown out of court. And get this, it says that when the man who is being executed is being taken out to be executed, there was to be someone at the head of the procession who shouted in a loud voice, "This is so-and-so who is about to be executed for such and such a crime on such and such a date," and say, "If you have any evidence in this case, come now." And not only that, get this, there was placed at the court a person standing outside the court who had a white handkerchief. There was a horseman who was put on a hill nearby, and if the horseman could see the person standing at the court, could also see the procession, if someone came in with fresh evidence in that case, the person on the court would wave the handkerchief and the horseman would gallop off and stop the execution. That is how precious the life of a murderer. That was the dignity that was accorded someone accused of killing someone else. And today in our culture, if you are poor, if you are an illegal immigrant, if you are mentally deranged, if you are somebody so poor that you live in a dilapidated cardboard shack underneath somebody's freeway, you are nonetheless to be honored and cherished by the people around you, says the Word of God. And I got to say, that includes yourself. You do not have the right to decide whether you deserve to live. Suicide is self-murder. And we don't have the right to do that. We don't have the right to decide how long someone else exists, nor do we have the right to decide whether and how long we exist. God takes those matters out of our hands. Today, it's impossible to speak about murder without mentioning Osama bin Laden, the mass murderer of 9/11. Osama bin Laden said that Jews and Americans and infidels, which include Muslims who don't agree with him, are to be annihilated no matter where they are or who they are, men, women, children, armed or unarmed. And today we have people who follow his philosophy are inflamed by that rhetoric, and they just remove whole categories of human beings as being people who are worth having life. Let me say that to say there are other forces that are more subtle and well-intentioned, I will even say, that nonetheless undermine the full force of the humanity of whole categories of people in our culture today. Are you young or are you old? Are you normal or are you abnormal? Are you wanted or are you unwanted? I read the other day that 90% of those children who are found to test positive for Down syndrome in the womb are aborted. A whole category of humans stripped of personhood. You may have noticed that when we baptize a baby here, we do something. We always take the child out of the arms of the parents in the actual baptism. And that's a way of us saying this child is honored and loved and valuable and cherished, even apart from the parents. This is a child of God. If you touch a human at any stage of that human's life, you are in the presence of something that you ought to fall down and bow before out of awe and wonder. I love what C.S. Lewis said. C.S. Lewis said, if you were to see the person sitting next to you right now, as they are going to be someday in heaven, they will become a person of such unutterable beauty that if you were to see them today as they're going to be then, you would be tempted sorely to fall down and worship that person. And then Lewis says, well then, since that's their destiny, why don't you start treating them that way today? We're all treasured. I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, Ross Johnson. Ross Johnson is just one of the most vibrant and wonderful people here. I will tell you, when Ross was born, it created a crisis in his family. And as a matter of fact, at the hospital, someone said to the parents, what do you want to do with him? They were stunned. And they said, well, we hope it's a trick question because we're going to take him home and love him. And boy, are they glad they did. Today, everywhere they go in the world, wherever they go, they always leave with friends because of Ross. How do I say this? Ross is a ham. Ross is a hot dog that all the mustard in the world cannot cover. And Ross is a great member of this church.